Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar focused on coach-athlete relationships. My name is Charles Infurna, and I'm going to take you on a coach-athlete relationship journey today that is focused on better ways, or ways rather, that coaches can enhance the relationships they have with their athletes. And a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is predicated on the research that my research partner and I have conducted, where we were able to interview collegiate athletes and ask them about their relationships, how they perceive their relationships with their coaches. And some of the excerpts and some of the pieces that they shared during our interviews is what we're going to talk about today, as far as what they thought helped them perform better and what kept them more engaged with their sport. And for the purpose of the project, with me being, having a background in coaching track and field, the athletes that we interviewed were all track and field athletes. It didn't happen, happen by chance, not on purpose, but we were able to sit down and talk with these individuals and really gather some insight in regards to how they perceive their relationships with their coaches and what their coaches did in order to keep them more engaged, like I said, more committed and more interested in what they were doing. Sit back and relax. Hopefully you enjoy our presentation here, where we include some strategies and tips and suggestions for coaches to implement. There's different tools in their toolbox to better enhance the relationships they have with their athletes. All right, now that we're through our introductions here, this will be the start of our presentation. So really what we're going to be talking about are coach-athlete relationships and strategies that coaches can implement to enhance their relationships with their athletes. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is research-based practices, best practices that help support coaches in providing them different tools and strategies to help them enhance the relationships with their athletes. So the overview of what we're going to talk about here. So we went through an introduction. So we're going to define coach-athlete relationships, and there's a model that I'm going to share that was developed and has been refined by Sophia Jowett. She is one of the leading researchers in the world when it comes to coach-athlete relationships, and that's the model that we used as far as our framework for the research that we conducted with the athletes that we interviewed for our project, and how I have modeled my coaching over the last 5 or 6 years since I got back into coaching recently. Then we're going to talk about what the athletes had to say. So a lot of the strategies come from excerpts from what our athletes shared and discussed during our research project. And the research project was really focused on interviewing college athletes and asking them about the perception of their relationship with their coaches. So we had a series of questions that we asked each of our athletes. Each interview lasted about an hour. And a lot of what we asked about was, tell us about your relationship with your coach. Tell us about ideal relationship that you picture in your mind of what a coach-athlete relationship, should look like. How did your relationship differ from the relationship that you had with your coach? And tell us about some specific experiences that you encountered or that you had over the time of your career with the specific coach. And a lot of what we pulled and a lot of the themes is what we're going to talk about here. And that's really where the strategies come from, as to what exactly athletes had to say about their relationships with their coaches, and how we as coaches can be better informed and how we could better work with our athletes moving forward based on what they had to say about that. And then lastly, we're going to tie it all together. So the last few slides are going to be really focused on the strategies, the tips, and different ways that we as coaches can better enhance our relationships with our athletes, how we could better work with our athletes in order to help them achieve the goals that they want to achieve. For us as coaches, this is something that I've borrowed from Judd Logan, a mentor of mine who's the throwing coach, and the head coach at Ashland University, 4-time Olympian. It's our job as coaches to illuminate a path for our athletes brighter than they can illuminate for themselves. And a lot of what the research suggests is that having, positive coach-athlete relationship, that's going to be the determining factor in how successful our athletes are in competition. So a lot of the focus of what I'm going to be talking about today is with track and field athletes, because that's where my background is in coaching track and field and throwers. But the themes are universal that can be implemented across any sports with any ages, whether you're working with youth athletes, middle school, high school, collegiate, post-collegiate. A lot of the tenets are universal, where they could be applied across all domains in sports. So let's get started here. How do we define coach-athlete relationships? And like I said, there's going to be a lot of research here because that's how my mind operates and how I want to present this information to everybody. So it's not going to be too dry, I promise. But really, how we define our coach-athlete relationships, and Jowett, like I talked about, and colleagues, really, coach-athlete relationship is defined as a situation in which a coach and athlete, their feelings, their cognitions, and behaviors are mutually and casually interrelated, right? So we are working with our athletes, and our athletes are working with us. And there's a lot of different factors that play a role in that. There's a whole lot of different there's a lot of different factors that play a role in how we interrelate with our athletes, and that's something that we're going to talk about further. Some of those pieces are, mutual respect, trust, having a belief, support, cooperation, communication. Those are the most important tenets when we're talking about components that contribute to performance and success, as well as satisfaction within the coach-athlete relationship, right? Because we want our athletes to be successful. We want our athletes to achieve their goals, whatever they set out for themselves. But we also want them to be satisfied, right? We want them to enjoy the time that they're with our team. That we want them to enjoy the time that they're participating and competing as well. So it's not only about the physical performance, but about their mental satisfaction as well. And really, the heart of the coach-athlete relationship, there's two different tenets here: performance enhancement and psychological well-being, right? So when we're talking about performance enhancement, really we're talking about in the essence of track and field, right? Throwing farther, running faster, jumping higher, and gaining physical strength. So those are the types of performance enhancements that we're talking about with coach-athlete relationships. And what the research has shown, and what we're going to talk about, is athletes that perceive their relationship with their coach to be stronger, to be very cooperative, very trusting and respectful. They outperform their peers who don't feel that their coach-athlete relationship lives up to the same standards and expectations. So if there's a lack of trust, a lack of communication in the coach-athlete dyad, those athletes aren't going to buy in as much with their coach, and they're also not going to perform as well based on what the research suggests. And then psychological well-being also, that's important as well, right? So we're talking about mindset, commitment, mental preparation, our feelings, and focus. And a lot of these tenets here is what we were able to pull out of the research with the athletes that we interviewed. So a lot of the psychological well-being has to do with the mental preparation, right? How do the coaches help their athletes prepare mentally for competition? How did the coaches help prepare the athletes for practice? How did they talk about their feelings, right? How do we get to know our athletes? By, communicating, engaging, which lends itself to commitment, right? If the athlete knows the coach is committed to them, they're going to reciprocate, and the athletes are going to spend more time engaging with their coaches. They're going to spend more time sharing information because they know as coaches that we care, that it's not just about a performance of they're going to jump the farthest or run the fastest or throw the farthest, but that we care about them as individuals. And if our athletes don't buy into that, if they don't think that we as coaches care about them as individuals, it's not going to work. The coach-athlete relationship isn't going to be as successful because there's a little bit of mistrust or maybe lack of communication, like I talked about. So a healthy coach-athlete relationship. So from the tenets, from the backdrop of being a throwing coach, right? A thrower who's committed and trusts her coach, right? The cognitions and the feelings that we talked about before, they're going to respond more positively to instructions, and they're going to be more respond to the coach's instructions more readily, right? So it's going to be a behavior, right? So if I instruct my athlete to, work on this physical cue in the circle, if they are committed and they trust me as their coach, they're going to follow through with that. So that's going to be the behavior. So that behavior is also going to be encouraged by commitment, trust, and responsiveness of the athlete. So then the coach feels more compelled to reciprocate the sentiments by showing a greater interest in the thrower as an athlete in person. And it goes both ways. There's another research project that I'm working on right now where I'm interviewing coaches and asking them about their perceptions of their relationship with their athletes. And it's really interesting because it is a two-way street, right? We want our athletes to do something physically in the circle, or if they're throwing a javelin on the runway or running on the track or what have you, pick your sport. But as coaches, like we're people also. So we're going to be encouraged by that commitment. And that's what the research suggests, is that athletes that buy in, the coaches are also, they're going to buy in as well. So when the coaches know that there's an athlete that's really committed to the program and they're going to, follow through on their actions and their commitments, and they're going to hold themselves accountable, it's just going to further enhance trust and respect from the coach's side as well. And they're going to reciprocate that. And like I said, they're going to be, they're going to show more interest as an athlete and a person with the person that they're working with the athlete that they're working with there. So in this example, really, we're talking about the relationship outcomes are positive because the coach is in a good position to nurture an athlete's potential. And that's really what we're talking about, right? We want to get the most out of our athletes, right? We want them to perform well. We want them to be safe. We want them to be healthy. The scenario, however, would be a little different if the coach or athlete were less committed, less trusting, and maybe less cooperative. And I've run into that as a coach before, where it's taken a year or two before athletes really are committed to the program and have been committed to myself, and that they really trust that I'm there to, get the most out of them. And that's a difficult conversation to have sometimes. I was talking to a coach earlier this morning when we were talking about expectations and how our athletes might rise or fall to the expectations that we have of them or that they might have of themselves. So it's important for us to have these conversations when it comes to, outcome goals and process goals. What do our athletes expect of themselves? And then how can we as coaches get them to live up to those expectations, right? For example, if an athlete wants to throw the shot put 60 feet, let's say, and they throw 59.11 and a half, which has happened, on many occasions. Does that mean that the athlete didn't live up to their expectations by that half inch? Does that mean that the coach didn't do enough to get the athlete over their goal, what they wanted to accomplish? And that's a tough scenario and a tough situation to be in. And I've been in it many times myself, where I've had high expectations for my athletes as far as performance. And I thought that they would have been able to perform at a higher level at a competition or meet, like a conference championship, for example. And then sometimes I had lower expectations of my athletes, and then they far exceed what I thought that they were capable of doing. And that's not because we didn't have a healthy relationship. It was just based on the conversation and based on how they were, following through on their commitments, that the commitments didn't show that they were capable of that performance. Where in practice, they were not throwing very well, but then we would show up to a meet and they would outperform what they were doing in practice. So we just had to reevaluate our expectations. So communicating, you're going to hear me talk about that a lot, is really the heart of what we're talking about here with our coach-athlete relationships. So Sophia Jowett's model of coach-athlete relationships is a 3+1C. Now, her initial research came out in 2002 when they really started looking at what is it about these coach-athlete relationships? Like what's the framework behind that? What's the theory? And her research came up with initially three different avenues of coach-athlete relationships: closeness, commitment, and complementarity. Excuse me. A few years ago, they came up with a +1 through the research. They found that there was a co-orientation piece there as well. So there's really four tenets of the coach-athlete relationships, and this is the model, the framework that Melissa and I, my research partner, we incorporated with the research that we conducted by interviewing the college athletes. That this was our framework, right? Sophia's model of coach-athlete relationships with the 3+1Cs. So closeness really refers to the effective meanings that athletes and coaches contribute to the relationship, right? So how much do I like my coach? How much do I trust my coach? How much do I respect my coach, right? How close are we? What type of information are we sharing? And for the coaches out there that are listening and watching this, we know sometimes our athletes might share maybe more information than they should when they come to us with a problem, or if they need help with something. That's the closeness that we have with our athletes. Like, I've had conversations with athletes that I don't think that they would have had with their parents, right? So for me as a coach, I knew that I had to be a chameleon. We have to wear many different hats. Sometimes I'm dad, sometimes I'm coach, sometimes I'm counselor, psychologist, friend. Depends on what our athletes bring to the table and how we develop that closeness with them. The commitment is really how are we maintaining our athletic relationship, and therefore trying to maximize our outcomes. So how committed are we to each other, right? If I have one of my athletes that says that they want to, like, say, become a national champion in the hammer throw, so that's a great goal. That's a great outcome goal, that they want to become a national champion. But then what type of how are they going to hold themselves accountable to maximizing their part of the relationship in order to achieve that goal? So the commitment is, if a coach sees that an athlete is working hard, they might work a little harder too, because they want to make sure that they're giving their athlete the best opportunity to be successful. However, if a coach or if an athlete is slacking and they're not holding themselves accountable, they're not going to the weight room, they're not watching film, they're not doing the other little things that it takes in order to be a great athlete, coach might not be as committed, because they see that the athlete isn't committed as well. And we got a little bit of that from our research that I'm going to talk about in a moment. Complementarity is really what we're talking about, is the athletes and coaches' behaviors of affiliation. So are the athletes friendly and responsive, right? Are the coaches friendly and responsive back? And reciprocal behaviors, right? And we're talking about, and it's tough to say about authority and compliance, right? But really, as coaches, we're instructing, and we expect that our athlete is going to execute based on our instructions. We know that our athletes have many different, or our athletes rather have many different ways that they learn and how they're going to, take in knowledge and information. And it's our job as a coach to instruct our athletes as best we can based on their specific needs. So some athletes are a learn by do. Some athletes need to watch a video. Some athletes need to watch, somebody else do whatever we're asking them to do before they are able to, complete a given task. So, for example, throwing the discus. Some athletes need to watch a lot of video for trying to correct a cue. Other athletes can just watch their teammates live in the moment. Other athletes need to, look at maybe like step by step in a book or something like that. So we need to be able to respond to our athletes based on, what their needs are, how we complement each other. And then the last piece, co-orientation. It's really our interpersonal perceptions that reflect our degree to which we have established a common ground in our relationships, right? So this is when we kind of tie everything together. What is the common ground in our relationship? right? What are our perceptions of that? Does the athlete feel that the coach is meeting them where they should? Does the coach feel that the athlete is meeting them where they should? So this is really an important tenet when we're talking about our coach athlete relationships. How do we perceive each other in the dyad, really, and what's our common ground? So it's kind of like a backdrop of the 3+1 C's when we're looking at the models of coach athlete relationships and how we're trying to develop those with our athletes and our kids. So what can coaches do to enhance the quality of their relationships with their athletes? So this is going to be where we're going to kind of share out a little bit of the information that our athletes shared with Melissa and I during our research, and different strategies and tips that coaches can implement to enhance the relationships with their athletes. And I do want to mention again, so we interviewed collegiate athletes that were all members of track and field programs. And that is one of, we talked about it in our paper that's under review again. That was one of the limitations of our studies, that we were looking to interview athletes across teams of low interdependence rather. So we wanted to interview athletes that were on golf teams, tennis teams, cross country, gymnastics, swimming and diving, track and field, obviously, because we feel that that's one, there's a gap in the literature there. There's not a lot of information from college athletes' perceptions of their relationships at that low interdependence rather, because once you're on the tee, you're playing tennis, you're on the 3-meter board, it's you and your thoughts, right? There isn't a coach out there with you. There isn't 10 other athletes, 10 other teammates on your team that are there to support you. It's just you. So that's the angle and the gap that we tried to address with this research. And fortunately, the journal that we submitted to gave us an opportunity to revise and resubmit. So they liked it so much that they wanted us to revise our paper to make it a little bit more clear, kind of touch up some things, and it's under review again. So this moving forward now is basically what our athletes shared with us about their relationships with their college coaches, or with their coaches rather. So the first thing that came out of our research was positive coaching, right? This is our first theme, positive coaching, how the coaches really interact with the athletes, the interpersonal skills that the coaches have, so how they interact with the kids, right? And autonomy supportive behaviors. So autonomy supportive behaviors, that's a strand of self-determination theory. So really, autonomy supportive behaviors, what we're talking about is, how do the athletes feel that their coaches allow them to become part of the process? So if you live up here in Western New York like I do, Sean McDermott of the Buffalo Bills always talks about the process, right? The process, the building of the franchise. Well, autonomy supportive behaviors are when coaches allow athletes to be part of that process, right? Whatever that process is, whether it's goal setting, developing team culture aspects as well. So these are the three big themes that came out of our research project. And now we're going to talk a little bit about what the athletes had to say specifically about those three themes, and how strategies can be incorporated to help support their relationships with athletes, how coaches can support their relationships with their athletes. So positive coaching, Dr. Rick McGuire. I had the pleasure of meeting Dr. McGuire at a coaching conference a couple years ago, where I presented some preliminary information from this particular project that we're talking about with these coach-athlete relationships. We hadn't finished interviewing all of the athletes yet, but I put together an abstract and went and presented what I had up until that point. And surprise to me, Dr. McGuire was in attendance with some other researchers from the University of Missouri. And I was in awe, because I knew of him. I knew he was the throwing coach and the head coach at the University of Missouri. He's coached Olympic medalists, world championship gold medalists in the throwing events. So for me, it was like, wow, like I can't believe I'm talking about my research, and really it was supported by all of Dr. McGuire's work, um, being a sports psychologist for USA Track and Field through the 90s and then the 2000s up until he retired from Missouri as their head coach, a few years ago. But really, everything is research based. Okay, and I don't want it to sound silly, but positive coaching really is scientifically and really philosophically a sound way to teach athletes how to compete and perform on a consistent basis. And this is something that I was talking about with another coach earlier today, about what our expectations are, right? And we want to be consistent with not only our expectations, but our performances as well, right? We don't want to be too high all the time, and we don't want to be too low. We kind of want to find the middle ground there a little bit. We want to be consistent so we know what to expect from our athletes on any given competition. And really, positive coaching, when you look at the tenets, they help athletes prepare better, perform better, and achieve more, which is obviously what we want of our athletes as coaches, right? We want them to set personal best. We want them to have, that personal excellence that Dr. McGuire talks about. And really, it empowers them to be, happier, healthier, and they're going to be more fulfilled in their investment in whatever sport that they are participating in. And that's really interesting there, right? Because it's not always, when we're talking about our athletes, we're not always talking about the Olympic gold medalist or the conference champion or, whatever term you want to throw in there. Each athlete is different, and they're going to be fulfilled and motivated based on their performances, but their performances don't always have to be attributed to a number, right? Especially with sports, it could be a performance in the classroom, for example, or in the community or their families. I know that's kind of stretching a little bit there, but really, if our athletes perform better, if they perceive themselves to be performing better, there's going to be an investment back, and they're going to be more motivated to continue to compete at that level and make themselves better and compete at a higher level. And positive coaching helps us with that. So what exactly is positive coaching? How do we see that in practice? It's how we as coaches shape our coaching philosophy, right? Our values. So when we reflect on our own values, what is it that's important to us, right? Our values help shape our coaching philosophy. So before I knew what grit was, and I started following Angela Duckworth's research on grit with high school students and math, and how she followed college students through the Army and boot camp before actually enrolling on campus in the fall. I didn't have a term for that, so I always valued that that my athletes were going to be able to, set their mind on something and not get distracted, and be able to stay committed on whatever they want to accomplish over a long period of time. And sometimes that was one season, sometimes it was 2 seasons, sometimes it was all 4 seasons that I was able to work with the athletes. So our values as coaches help shape that coaching philosophy, right? Our coaching philosophy. What do we stand for as coaches? And if someone asked you today what you value as a coach and what your coaching philosophy is, what would you say? That's going to say a lot about what our values are. So what I value as a coach, it's my job. Like I said, I value grit, and I value honesty and commitment and open communication. And that's what I see as important factors for myself and my coaching philosophy. And I think it's reflective on the kids that I've worked with over the years. And like I said, I didn't know what grit was in 2004 when I first started coaching, but I knew that I didn't want my kids to be distracted. I knew that I wanted them to focus in on what they wanted to accomplish. And that if they didn't get lazy, or if they didn't get bored, that they stayed committed and accountable to their actions, that they would achieve that. That's really what the definition of grit is. Communication as well. I value open communication, and I've always had an open door policy. Like I said, I've always valued getting to know my athletes and them being able to share with me and me sharing with them. Now, you obviously have to get to know your kids before you delve into too much information. But when I first started coaching, I was coaching my teammates. I was 22 years old. I had no idea what I was doing. I was a graduate assistant, and I was working with the majority of the kids that I was teammates with the year before. So it was a learning process. What my philosophy was back then is kind of like a 180 to what we're looking at right now, where I was only focused on their performances. And we did have conversations because I knew them as teammates, but we didn't get too deep because I did know them as teammates. And, when you're teammates with somebody, sometimes you let your guard down, you share more information maybe than you would like, not knowing or not possibly realizing that person that you're sharing that information with is going to be your coach the following year. So I was so focused on having them throw farther that I got away from, we're just kids. They're student teaching. They're getting ready to take their New York State tests in order to become better, or to become classroom teachers, to better shape the minds of children in the future. And all I wanted them to do was throw far, because I was afraid as a coach at D3 Fredonia that I would get fired or not asked to come back if they didn't throw far, which is difficult for me to say now, but that was my reality back then. That's all I thought, and that's what I valued the most, was the performance, not about the process, not about making sure you're committed to practice. Make sure you're committed to come into practice 4 times a week. Make sure you're committed to going to the weight room. Make sure you're committed to taking care of your body, making sure you take care of your nutrition, all those other factors that play a role in it. That was the farthest from my mind back then. So your philosophy can evolve as a coach. But when we're talking about positive coaching, one of the first tenets there is, what is our coaching philosophy? So one of the pieces that I encourage coaches to do and to reflect upon is, what is your coaching philosophy? If you had to give your elevator pitch and you're applying for that big Division I job or professional job or whatever it is in your respective sport, and you have, the elevator pitch, right? Those 15, 20 seconds from floor to floor. What would you say in that time? Like, how would you be reflective on what your philosophy is as a coach? And our values are going to be predicated, or our coaching philosophy rather, is going to be predicated on what our values are when we're developing that coaching philosophy. So what athletes had to say about that when we're talking about interpersonal skills is relationship development, reinforcement of positive behaviors, and creating a positive team culture. So relationship development, the heart of it is communication, right? How well do we communicate with our athletes? Is it positive in nature? Do our athletes know that we're really engaged in getting to know them better as people, not just as athletes that we have on the team, right? How are we going to develop those relationships? And the athletes that we talked about said that their performances, they felt, were predicated on how well they felt they had a relationship with their coach. And a couple of the athletes that had coaching changes throughout their career had off years that first year because there wasn't a relationship that was developed yet, right? So either there was a lack of trust, there was a lack of communication, there was a lack of mutual respect. Their performances suffered. So our interpersonal skills are ways that those are things that can be taught, right? How are we going to develop those relationships with our kids? How are we going to communicate with them? Reinforcing positive behaviors. This was an interesting one because a lot of the athletes felt that they had a more powerful relationship with their coach when their coaches reinforced positive behaviors not associated with track and field. The coaches that shared, or the athletes rather, that shared that their coaches had conversations with them about nutrition, about rest, about recovery, about taking care of their classwork, um, said that they felt that their coach was more committed to them because they reinforced these positive behaviors. They shared that they were proud of their kids that had the GPAs, that did work in their community, that were involved with other aspects of um, their school activities and clubs. So how are we reinforcing those positive behaviors? Do you as coaches know, what your athletes' majors are? That was the first thing that I tried to figure out as a coach is, okay, what's their major? How can I help them, achieve their goal, right? So when I was at Fredonia as a teaching school, so a lot of my athletes were student teachers, or they were education majors rather. And over the years, I had to, change kind of like our practice culture, because I had kids that were coming from student teaching. So they were coming a little later. So it was important for us to reinforce positive behaviors that, oh no, we're not skipping practice. We're committed to something else that is going to be there far longer after our throwing careers are done. And creating a positive team culture, we could do a whole webinar on that. But really, how does the coach create a positive team culture? And a lot of what the athletes had to talk about with creating a positive team culture was having them be part of developing it themselves, right? And that's what I was talking about with one of my coaching friends the other day, that as coaches, we kind of have an expectation or an idea of what we want to instill in our team, but really it's the athletes that are going to buy into that positive team culture. So what types of activities, what type of team building activities are you incorporating? How are you communicating with your athletes that helps form better relationships with the kids? That's what we're talking about with creating a positive team culture. We tried doing that at Fredonia amongst our group of throwers and with the bigger team as well. Same thing at Nazareth, right? We were always talking about different team building activities, different ways that we could create a positive culture where we're celebrating our athletes, right? And it didn't always have to be celebrations of athletic endeavors, that it could be celebrations of other college activities or community activities or, what have you. But creating that positive team culture really made a difference and really stood out with the athletes that we interviewed for a research project. So the relationship development piece, right? So the communication is key. I think it's the most important factor in enhancing coach-athlete relationships. How we communicate with our athletes, when we communicate with our athletes, the tone in which we communicate with our athletes. Has to be respectful, right? We want to treat our athletes as we would like to be treated, right? That's the golden rule. But we want to utilize and demonstrate positive and constructive responding, right? And this was something that I had difficulty with initially as a coach, that my responses weren't always positive. They were more on the sarcastic side at times, and that didn't work really well. And I didn't realize that until the athletes talked to me about it. And after we had conversations, then it was more constructive in a positive manner, and it was more active. And you have to get to know your kids too. Some athletes wanted reinforcement on cues after every single throw. Others, they wanted cues and reinforcement and conversation maybe once every 10 throws. Other kids didn't want me to say anything to them at all. So how you develop those relationships with your kids is really going to be predicated on how you communicate with them. And at St. John Fisher College, when I was enrolled in the doctorate program, we had to give a presentation on experiences that we'd had in developing relationships. And I was talking about a project that I had worked on with a previous employer. And then I started immediately to transition to coaching, and we talked about success in coaching. And somebody asked me how I knew I was a successful coach. And I said, well, up until that point, I had some success with athletes, setting school records and breaking into the top 10 at schools and All-American and things like that. But I said I gauge um, my success as a coach based on one, if the athletes continue communicating with me after um, they graduate from college. And I say that tongue in cheek, but I think it's really important that we're not just there for them for the 4 or 5 years that they're enrolled in college, but we're there for them after the fact as well. And I still get letters and emails. Well, emails, not so much handwritten letters, and text messages asking about, letters of recommendation and advice and, career changes and all these different things that happen, in people's lives once they graduate from college, if that's a decision that they choose to make. And that's how I gauge my success as a coach, that my athletes from 10, 15 years ago still communicate with me via text message or Facebook or social media. And that they ask, what I think about things. And even the athletes that I coached who are now coaches, I ask them for advice. I ask them for help, or I ask them to, give me some tips or suggestions on things. And it's interesting how that works, because if we didn't communicate well when we were a coach athlete dyad, it might not work. We might not be interested, or they might not be interested in talking to me now if they had a horrible experience when I was their coach, either at Fredonia or even now at NAS. So how can we enhance our interpersonal skills? Because I think it is something that you can work on, much like other factors of our personality that we could try and enhance. So open and honest communication. We've talked about that, and I think you've probably heard it ad nauseum. So that's one of the strategies here. And then model gratitude. And this one is really interesting because I shared something on a recruiting visit once in front of my other athletes, and I didn't mean to at first, but it really boils down to how I interact with my kids at the college level. And if that athlete just so happens to watch this webinar, they can comment on that because they were well within earshot of the conversation. But modeling gratitude, I would thank my athletes when they came to practice, and I'd say, hi, so-and-so, thanks for coming today. I appreciate you, and I appreciate you coming to throwing practice. And at first they would look at me kind of funny, but at the Division III level, you don't have to be a member of interscholastic athletic team, right? You're there because you want to be there. And I would express my gratitude in them coming, because if I didn't have any athletes, I wouldn't be coaching, right? So I would greet them at the door. Something that I'm going to share now is something that I've never shared with anybody, I don't think, besides this one recruiting visit. But during the day, I'm a researcher, and I focus on early childhood education and classroom quality and environments, right? So how well do our teachers interact with our kids? And there's a piece in there. There's a tool that's incorporated across the country. It's called the classroom assessment scoring system. And one of the factors, tenets of the classroom assessment scoring system is how teachers interact and engage with their students. And what we're talking about here are preschool age kids. So we're talking about 4 or 5 years old before they transition to kindergarten. And on this recruiting trip, I was talking to a family, and I said, really, at the onset of the season, and depending on the personality of the team, I treat my athletes like they are kindergartners or pre-K students. Greet them at the door, meet them where they are, try and develop those types of relationships with them. And the parents kind of looked at me funny, and my athlete was, I don't know, maybe 10 feet away, and they heard that, and I knew instantly, oops, I don't know if this is going to backfire on me or not. But really, a lot of the literature in early childhood education on how to develop quality classroom environment is predicated on the interactions between the teachers and the kids. So in pre-K, you're looking at, are kids able to expand their vocabulary? Do teachers, get down at eye level with their kids? And something, I can't do that for some reasons because athletes that I've coached are like 6'5" or 6'7". Like I can't reach them eye level, but I can get close enough that I can try and whisper in their ear. But really, I was trying to set up an environment that I knew would be conducive to them learning best and nurturing. And that's me by trade. So that worked for me because I'm a teacher by trade, middle school, high school teacher. But really modeling that gratitude and thanking your kids to come made a world of difference for me. And you could do that also. Hey, Tyler, thanks for coming to practice today. I really appreciate it. I know, you have a lot going on with studying for finals, but I appreciate you taking this hour and not blowing off practice. Makes a world of difference. Or Gabs, thanks for coming. I know you have, a lab in 45 minutes, but I appreciate you coming in and getting your reps in before you go off and take that test. I know you're going to do a great job on it. It helps you take the temperature of the room too by greeting your athletes as they're warming up and loosening up, and you can kind of walk around and see where their heads are at as well, right? Where the communication piece comes into play. So if I have athletes that are coming from a lab or from class, or they had a negative interaction with, I don't know, a peer, friend, their significant other, whatever, that helps me readjust my practice plan, because I know that their head really isn't wrapped around throwing right now, and that they are wrapped around whatever their problem is that they're having. So those couple minutes as the kids are warming up and we're preparing for what cues we're going to focus on during practice is really important. So modeling that gratitude, or having them, hopefully, share a little bit about how their day has been going, goes a long way in setting up your practice plan. And it just helps build positive culture when your kids know that you're thankful of them for coming to practice. And then lifelong learning. What the athletes talked about, and I thought this was really interesting as well, is that they felt that their coaches continued to learn about the sport of track and field. They shared that their coaches went to conferences, that they went to clinics, that they watched YouTube videos, that they listened to podcasts, that they tried to make themselves better in order for them to help make their athletes better. And I thought that was huge. When I was in college, YouTube, social media, really wasn't invented. So unless you physically went to a conference or you had somebody come to you, it wasn't as easy to enhance your learning, especially when we're talking about track and field. Now on social media, there's YouTube videos and webinars like this that coaches can listen to, and then they can apply what they learn in these webinars into their, daily practices, routines, right? Or they can, help build their philosophy. They can help build their team's culture. But being a lifelong learner, right? What are you doing to make yourself better as a coach? Are you watching videos? Do you just show up every year and you're not really dedicated to the sport? Like you're just there because it's another season, right? And it's an extra stipend. Like our athletes realize that. I realized that when I was in high school. Some of the coaches that I had, they were just there because, one, they needed somebody. They didn't really have a big or strong background in it, and it showed. And our performances showed also. So what are we doing as coaches to become lifelong learners? How are we able to take advantage of what social media has to offer in order to make ourselves better as coaches? And it doesn't always have to be about technical skills, because that's not what this webinar is about, but more about enhancing relationships. So how are we able to learn more about that? And if you've made it this far, then I would consider you a lifelong learner, that you're taking the time out to make yourself better and learn a little bit more about this topic and how you can incorporate different strategies in order to enhance your skills, in order to provide your athletes the best opportunities in order to be successful. So the last one is autonomy supportive behaviors. So like I said, it's a facet of self-determination theory developed by Ed.D. and Rich Ryan, who are also at the University of Rochester, that enables others to identify intrinsic motivation. So really what we're talking about is autonomy supportive behaviors is a facet of that, of self-determination theory. and intrinsic motivation. So we are motivated to do something because we want to internally. We want to get better, as opposed to external motivation, where we might be motivated by a scholarship or performance or some other outside factor. And autonomy supportive behaviors are part of that. So what is it? Really, it's a need for someone to have some control over the course of their life and some of the decisions that they make about themselves, for themselves, and by themselves, right? So this is autonomy of our athletes having some control over the facet of their athletic endeavor. And for some coaches, this might be difficult to kind of loosen the reins, I guess, if you will, of what are we providing our athletes when it comes to autonomy? Do we let them become part of the process? Do we give them any decision making responsibilities as a member of our team? If you say yes, then it's going to enhance the relationship that you have with your athlete. If you say no, then that's where the lack of trust and respect might come into play, because our athletes then don't trust that we might be looking out for their best interest if we're not giving them a voice or an opportunity to be heard. So autonomy supportive behaviors, what our athletes talked about was the goal setting process, and this was huge. And athletes that described their coaches having these autonomy supportive behaviors had more interest, excitement, persistence, and engagement in their athletic endeavors. The research that Melissa and I conducted was with college athletes. The research that Sophia Jowett and her colleagues have looked at has been with Olympic caliber athletes. Benny and O'Connor, they looked at professional athletes, Ambrose and Anderson Butcher, same thing, right? So what we're looking at really is when we give our athletes some autonomy, right? They have more interest, they're a little bit more excited, and there's a little bit of accountability there. And with our athletes, what they talked about was goal setting, is that their coaches would sit down with them at the beginning of the season and have a conversation and try and develop a roadmap of where they wanted to go or where they wanted to be by the end of the season. I have this conversation with all of my athletes, and I talk about it ad nauseum, and any of them, they're going to comment on this or will probably say the same thing, that they've heard enough about it. But I feel like it is so important that we allow our athletes to share their expectations with us, right? What do they want to accomplish? Because some athletes, not all of our athletes rather, want to win. They don't all want to be conference champions. They don't all want to be national champions. They don't all want to be All-Americans. Some of them just want to be members of the team. Some of them just want to get into better shape. Some of them just want to be part of something because they were part of something in high school. And whatever goals they have, we need to allow them to be part of that process. And they need to be part of the plan in order to achieve that goal. And it's our job, like I said at the beginning of this presentation, to illuminate a path for our athletes brighter than they can illuminate for themselves, right? That's really what we're here for. We want our athletes to get from one point to another and realize their dreams, achieve their goals, right? That's, I mean, for me, that's what coaching is about, right? It doesn't always have to be with an athletic performance. It could be in the classroom too. I've had plenty of athletes that talked about goals in regards to hitting a certain GPA, attending a certain amount of classes, all these things that when I had first started coaching, that was farthest thing from my mind. But having them be part of the process, having them be part of their goal setting and putting the plans in place, it's going to hold them more accountable to their commitments. If we have an athlete that says that they want to be a conference champion, whatever event. Okay, well, what's it take to get to be a conference champion? Let's look at the previous conference champions that you've competed against. What kind of traits do they exhibit? What type of commitment do they show? What other things do they do outside of the track that allows them to become conference champions? And I've had the luxury of having conference champions on my team. So as a conference champion graduated and moved on, and other athletes that were their teammates, their peers, wanted to be conference champions. Okay, are you committed to do what so-and-so did? Are you committed to to do the ice bath every night? Are you committed to, take care of your nutrition? Are you committed to keeping a journal where you're able to share your thoughts to yourself and, just write and keep a training log? Are you committed to doing all of those things? That's all part of this autonomy supportive behaviors and goal setting process. Everything's tied into that. But with them sharing what their goals are and putting a plan in place, it holds them accountable to it as well. Plus, they're going to be more engaged because it's something that they came up with on their own. They're going to be more excited. They're going to be more interested in achieving that goal because it's something that they set for themselves, not something that we set for them as coaches. With the increased autonomy, right, we talked about that. Allow them to be part of the decision-making process when it comes to goal setting. And then also, it provides athletes the opportunity to establish cultural norms for your team, and expectations equal accountability, right? What we expect is what we're going to be accountable for, right? If we have low expectations, there's going to be low accountability. If there's high expectations, there's going to be higher accountability. But having our athletes be part of that and having them set the tone, and that's where it's really helpful if you have, juniors or seniors that kind of have been around you as a coach for a few years. They understand what the cultural norms are. They understand that, when you come to this program or you're part of this program, this is how we do things here, right? And hopefully they're positive and they're nurturing and caring and supportive, but that helps increase their performances as well, based on what our athletes shared with us during our research project. So really bringing everything together, right? This kind of thing what everyone maybe has been waiting for. So what do we value as coaches, number one? How do we set up our philosophy? There's a lot of different activities I'll share with you if you're so interested in regards to defining your values. And these are things that I talk about with my athletes as well. I've given many presentations at other colleges and high schools with athletes because their athletic philosophy is also going to be predicated on what they value as athletes, right? What are their values? How are they going to stay true to themselves, and do their actions equate to their expectations, right? Are they doing what they need to do in order to get where they want to go? And it comes down for us as coaches, what do we value as a coach, right? What's important to us, and how does that help develop our coaching philosophy, and how are those values reflected in our coaching philosophy? We've talked about that in some of the previous slides here. So effective communication is paramount, right? It's got to be consistent, open, honest, and non-judgmental. And it's something that I learned also along the way, is that, our athletes, when they come to us, it's because they might not have anybody else that they feel comfortable talking to. It's important for us to not be non-judgmental when they are sharing, whatever information they're sharing with us, right? And there's an analogy of, a fig tree. I don't know if anybody's familiar with fig trees, but I have one growing in my backyard. But the foliage on a fig tree is so big that is so difficult to gauge whether that fig tree is actually producing fruit, right? So it's difficult to gauge them from the outside. So if we're looking at an athlete and kind of reflected on fig trees, for example, if you can, use that, imagine or picture that in your mind, you don't know if the fig tree is bearing fruit unless you uncover a leaf, right? And that's what we're talking about with not being non-judgmental with our kids, is meeting them where they are and getting to know them. And part of that is effectively communicating with them. So from afar, you can't tell if a fig tree is producing fruit, but you have to get up close to it. You turn over a leaf, and then you're able to tell if it's producing a fruit. Same thing with our athletes, right? We don't, it's difficult to gauge from the outside, just from the exterior. But once we get to know our athletes, effectively communicating with them, that helps enhance our relationships with them. Reinforcing the positive behaviors with our athletes. And again, this is my experiences and sometimes treating my kids as they are pre-K students, is reinforce those positive behaviors over and over and over again. Helps elicit trust, helps elicit respect, and it just helps develop more positive relationships with them when we are reinforcing positive behaviors with them. Another piece is modeling gratitude, being thankful, of our athletes, being thankful that they came to practice, being thankful of um, our experiences, right? Modeling that. How do we model that? By being, consistent with our communication, by being honest, by being open with them. Autonomy supportive behaviors, allowing our athletes to be part of the decision-making process. This was really difficult for me also. But the athletes that we interviewed shared that they felt more committed to their coach because they allowed them to share their goals, allowed them to be part of the decision-making process, and allowed them to be part of, the competition prep as well. That's something I didn't talk about before. But our athletes, as we develop relationships with them, the longer we've known them, for example, so if I have a freshman or sophomore, um, I might not, the leash might be a little shorter, let's say, when it comes to how they feel about practice or, weight room, or, if they're coming to practice and you can tell that they're not really as enthusiastic. With a freshman or sophomore, I might be a little bit more persistent in participating in practice, or I might spend a little bit more time with that athlete in regards to how things are going. Now, when they're juniors or seniors, then the conversation might be a little different. I've spent 3 or 4 years with them. And if they say, hey, coach, you know what, I'm not feeling it today, something happened, or, what have you, insert the reason here, I might be a little bit more lenient and say, okay, you know what? Yeah, I trust you. I know you don't want to blow off practice today, but you have whatever's going on in your life right now. We'll take a couple throws and then, you could go a little earlier, right? Or if you want to come back later after you kind of gather yourself, you could do that too. And we just need to be able to gauge our athletes in those regards, but give them some of that flexibility, give them some of that opportunity to share that is really important. And expectations equal accountability. And I wish I would have shared or had that conversation with the coach earlier today and had it posted because I could refer to it a little bit more, but we'll keep that for later and I'll refer to that after. But really what our expectations are is what we're going to be, accountable for, right? If we have high expectations, there might be greater accountability, and how we set the tone for that as coaches. What are our expectations of our athletes? And I ask them all the time, what do you expect of me during the season? And at first, it was a little difficult for me to be able to, process that information because I was afraid. I was being vulnerable but I wanted to know. I wanted to know what my athletes expected of me as their coach. And like I said, it wasn't always about throwing. There were other factors that played a role in that as well, right? So how was I going to help them outside of track, right? Were there expectations about helping set up like internships or writing letters of recommendation, or whatever your athletes come to you with? What the expectations are, that sets the accountability for that piece, and that they would hold me accountable. And I'm not afraid to share that sometimes they didn't think that I was living up to my expectations. We had a conversation about that, and then I was able to see it from their perspective of, oh, coach, you said you were going to spend more time with me, or we were going to do this, or you were going to do that. I don't know that if you don't tell me. And now, being a little older and hopefully a little wiser, I'm able to process those pieces a lot easier. But as coaches, what we have is expectations. What is, how are we going to hold that? How are we going to hold our expectations accountable? Listen, I gathered over the course of our research, these are some pieces that, I've collected, over the years as being a coach, and what our research-based practices and methods in order to enhance the relationships that we have with our athletes. I hope this information was helpful to you. They're high or low in regards to our our athletes and working with our athletes.